Welcome to the Helsi podcast, where we invite you to invest in your well-being and unlock the secrets of vibrant health, peak performance, and wellness. Join us, Sebastian Mierau and Johannes Kettelhout, co-founders of Australia and New Zealand's leading wellness company, as we dive deep into the science, strategies, and stories that empower you to live your healthiest, happiest life. Whether you are a CEO, high achiever, entrepreneur, elite athlete, health enthusiast, scientist, or self-improvement seeker, together we will explore the cutting edge of biohacking techniques and holistic health practices with world-class experts that optimize your mind, body, and spirit. With each episode, you will walk away with practical and actionable steps to integrate in your daily life. Are you ready? Let's elevate your well-being.
Well, Gary, exciting to have you on the show. I'm really looking forward to that because I think it's a topic that, especially over the last, I believe, 5 to 10 years, has really become to the forefront of a major issue of modern society, I guess, and that there's actually so much we can do about it, but also that there's so many issues that we previously have not acknowledged. And maybe that's also just a shift of how society thinks about mental health, but it's certainly something I'm super passionate about and really eager to learn more. So thank you very much for being available.
No, I'm really happy to be here, Sebastian. And I think that it is certainly something that has been a little more prominent over the last 5 or 10 years. And it's strangely complex and complicated, but at the same time, quite simple as well. Not easy, but simple. And, I think that part of what I hope to bring to the world of mental health or mental strength or anything in that realm is that just another voice that might resonate with people. I think that might be where we've let ourselves down over time. It's been the same types of voices for a number of years, and that has alienated particular groups from speaking up about mental health. And hopefully that tide is starting to shift a little.
Yeah. And I believe in the line of work that you were in, and you were really high end there of protecting the Australian Prime Minister and also holding the office of the Australian Federal Police Commissioner. Yeah,
I looked after the commissioner's office. Yeah, I wasn't the commissioner, but I
right,
ran his
on. Yeah.
office. Yeah,
Yeah.
I didn't have that pay packet.
The duty that comes in that line of work would suggest to me that you feel really purposeful, that like you feel really you do a really honorable job. How is it that mental health comes into the picture, in particular in these frontline professions?
Yeah, it's a great question. In fact, it's probably not a question I've been asked before. And I think at the the frontline professions or the emergency services, the military, it happens quite a bit in high performance athletes as well, and even high performance business. You tend to live a fulfilling life where you are focused on fulfilling work, I suppose, but it's also very narrow. It's very narrow towards the job that you're doing. It is a fulfilling role, but what tends to happen is people get their identity completely wrapped up in the work that they do. They tend to become,
Yes.
Again, their identity is what they do, not who they are. And that fulfillment and that value and that purpose in life is extremely narrow when you work in the pointy end of anything, when you're at the high performance field of any industry. But even as in parenting or relationships, if your sole focus is on being the best dad that you can be, then that's very narrow. There are a lot of things that fall by the wayside outside of that. And, I think people that are in high performance fields or very action orientated fields can have fulfilling work. But again, it's very narrow. And so what tends to happen is relationships fall by the wayside. Work becomes the primary source of your life, and therefore everything else falls away. And if you happen to hit a few hurdles or you happen to retire, much like the military or athletes that retire early, you tend to fall in a big hole because your purpose and your fulfillment no longer exists, and your identity was so attached to your role that you kind of feel like you don't know who you are anymore.
I relate to that. Leading an organization, coming home, it is sometimes a struggle to wear a different hat. And in fact, there are sort of tricks like alter egos that you can bring to the workplace. You wear your uniform when you come at home. If you need to put actually a Hawaiian shirt on just to know you're the fun dad now. And I know people that are in the military and the police. They come home and they found it hard to change their tone and become that soft person. And I believe there can be struggle because of that. But for you, it was even before you finished your career, you already struggled with mental health. While actually having a really fulfilling job. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And look, I had a great 18-year career with the Australian Federal Police, and I did some fantastic roles there. All of them quite fulfilling. A lot of them very much in the high performance realm, high responsibility, high profile. But it's interesting that you touch on almost having an alter ego at work and at home, and I think there is a bit of work around this where people have spoken about being quite successful at putting on your work hat, putting on your home hat, and all of those things. And I actually find that there's probably a better nuance to doing that when you can do some work around your own identity and really digging deep on the who you are part, not the what you do. And what I try and work with people on is creating that identity and then taking that same identity to work, but asking yourself, how does this person show up to work? And then before you go in the house, you might look at that vision of that identity again and say, how does this person show up at home? And what I actually found over time was I had the alter ego thing down quite well. I was a particular person at work. I was a particular person at home. I was a different person with my mates. I was a different person on the golf course. But none of those people were genuinely me. I was playing a part. I was playing a role. I was turning up the way other people might have expected me to. I was turning up the way that I thought I was supposed to be at work, trying to get promotions or working longer hours and so what I've now found is if I can really and strongly identify who I am as a person, I don't have to play a role anymore. I can turn up everywhere. In this conversation with you, I am focused on the same set of values as when I go and play golf tomorrow morning, when I go out with my friends, when I'm sitting with my daughter. The same set of values comes with me. It's just that this conversation is aimed a little different because the purpose of this conversation is different than sitting with my daughter, but it's the same person moving in the same direction towards the same future state of myself. And I find that a lot easier way to manage mental health and even perform at a better level because now it's intrinsic value that you're bringing to your role, not seeking external validation.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I call that sometimes with our team showing up full spectrum. We don't want just a machine at work that doesn't show its full personality. And often it also feels a little bit like is just your head working or is actually your heart involved in your decisions, which to me is super important because you just feel a very different vibe at work or between a customer and yourself if you actually show up as a genuine person. So how did that make you feel when you compartmentalized, in a sense, yourself in so many different Garys?
Yeah, well, I think it's not something I really recognized until a long time after, after I'd hit my hurdles or my struggles and look back and, to get back to it, I was 18 years in the Federal Police, but the last 10 years of that, I was battling a major depressive disorder and also a gambling addiction that cost me $2 million. It cost me my career ultimately through some poor choices at work. Certainly the reputation that I built over 18 years and maybe even over 40 years, that was gone. And I was very close to, well, certainly considering the value of my own life is the way that I'd like to put it. And that was a very scary circumstance. And the odd thing to me was that 10-year period was actually the most successful period I had at work. That was the most successful part of my working life, was that 10-year period. But I was the most broken during that period of time. And, it probably wasn't until, this is 7 or 8 years ago now. So it's probably not until, 4 or 5 years past that where I started to put a few of the pieces together and realize I was never really conscious about how I was turning up at work, how I was turning up at home, how I was turning up in other parts of my life. I basically just got on the treadmill. There's a great quote from Thomas Merton that says, people will spend their whole life climbing a ladder only to realize when they get to the top, they've put it against the wrong wall. And I think what I was doing, and look, I loved my job, and perhaps if I had have been more conscious about it, it would have went in a different way. But I put my ladder up against the wall, and I just went for it. And I just kept going and go. I didn't bother to stop to make sure that there wasn't another wall that was equally as important, or when we get to the top, can we combine walls together? It was just, and this is a thing that a lot of people in high performance do. And it's necessary because you have to be laser focused to be high performance. But I also feel like you can sustain optimum performance longer if you are able to be conscious about your reasons for being there. There are always going to be other elements of your life that exist, and if you ignore those, then one day they can come back to bite you. So it's a very delicate balance sometimes, but it's difficult because, again, for 10 years I was battling depression and a gambling addiction, and probably for 7 of those I masked it from myself. Like it wasn't like I was hiding it from other people. I was pretending to myself that I wasn't struggling. We use things like, I'll be okay when I get a holiday. I'll keep working hard until I get a promotion. I'm just tired. Once I can have a good sleep, I'll be all right. All of these things are actually us masking the problem from ourselves. We're trying to push the problem onto some other issue. We're trying to make sure that we're a victim. We're not the person responsible. And I did that for a long time as well. It's when you're a problem solver by trade, it's very hard to admit that you've got a problem. And so, the last thing that we want to do is be responsible for our own pain. I masked it from myself for a lot longer than I masked it from other people. And that is probably where you end up in more trouble than not.
Yeah. So what changed for you that you actually were more aware of it and realized that something is not going so well?
Yeah, look, I think just that I think we often, or we always, get warning signs. And again, if we talk about a 10-year period that I battled with depression, there would have been warning signs in the first year. They were probably very small, and I just didn't listen to them. And then all of a sudden, the world has a funny way of making sure those warning signs are a little louder the next time around. And if you don't listen, they will get louder. And if you don't listen, they will get louder. And I got to a stage where, probably about 7 years in, the way I would describe it is I vividly remember hugging my children and not wanting to be anywhere near that embrace. I just, these people like your family, your parents that you love the most in the world, and I just didn't want to be there. It's not that I wanted to be. I'm not talking about wanting to be dead or anything like that. I just did not want to be in that embrace. I just couldn't feel anything. And that's probably the first time I really started to think, hang on, this is not right. I'm a guy who's come from a loving family. We've got a big family, and not wanting to be around family was starting to, that caused me a little bit of concern. But even still, it wasn't enough. Like I started having some conversations with people, but still really struggling, still thinking I could figure it out, still not knowing what the problem was. And again, sometimes for men or for high performers, if I don't know what the problem is, can't really go to somebody and tell them, hey, I've got a problem. If I've got a broken arm, I go to the doctor and say my arm hurts. If I don't know what the problem is, I sort of try and figure out what the problem is first before I go and ask someone about it. And, so then I didn't really listen to that warning sign either. And eventually I made some stupid mistakes with my work credit card, and, I get a knock on the door from the deputy commissioner to start to explain my behavior. And that was probably the start of really having to turn my life around. But that another 12 months later went by, and I was still struggling. And that's when I was getting very close to really exploring suicide as an option. And to me, that was probably the turning point that I hit the most. I realized at that moment that I really did only have 2 options, and one was to to end it, and the other was to do whatever was necessary to come through the other side. And thankfully, I made what I'd like to consider was a good choice at the time. And, another 5 years, 6 years down the track, I'm still here.
Yeah. I will ask you a little bit about what can be done, but just for people who listen who might have been in this situation, I remember when I wrote my thesis, I was under a lot of pressure because I didn't speak English well, but the thesis was in English. And at one stage, I was lying in bed and thinking, but the easiest would be really if I just kill myself. And I remember the body really revolting against it. It felt really like each cell says like, hold on, this is not the right idea here. And I think that's when I sort of backed up and I think I asked for an extension or took the pressure off. But that's quite extreme. That's quite and that was just a thesis. That was not even something, like people have very different problems that really feel like way more pressure. And I just wonder, like, what can you do? Like, what can you at that moment? What's the best thing to do to make the most out of this insight in the moment, rather than pushing it away, going back to the gambling table, to the alcohol, whatever you have, but actually like just having that memory. If ever this happens, what's the thing that makes sure you follow through on actually investigating whether there's a problem?
Yeah, no, I think it's interesting. I don't think it really matters what. I mean, you talked about your thesis being the consideration point, and perhaps other people have other difficulties. I don't actually think it serves anybody to compare the issue and the reason why they might have the thought, because everybody's problems are big to them. Right? It could be financial, it could be relationships, it could be an addiction, it could be depression, it could just be things aren't going so well today. But if it's your problem, it's very big for you. And I remember having a conversation with a psychologist, and I certainly want to make sure that if people are struggling out there, that talking to somebody, I don't care who it is, right? That just talking to somebody first is certainly a very sensible or good approach, even if you are nervous about it. There are plenty of anonymous helplines as well, like if you don't want to talk to a friend. So before I start having this part of the conversation, I want to make sure that people are aware that the best thing to do is actually to get it out of your own head and talk to someone. Even talking out loud to yourself can be more beneficial than letting it run around in your own head, because when you say something out of your mouth, you hear it with your ears, which makes it sound like it's coming from somebody else. And typically we can solve somebody else's problems, or we're more willing to solve somebody else's problems than we are our own. Right? So, so sometimes even just saying it out of your own mouth, if nobody's around, can be a good first step. But I had a conversation with a psychologist, and I found it very interesting when he told me that the consideration of suicide isn't an unnatural thought process for the brain itself. Because if you consider what the brain's job is, the brain's job ultimately is to keep you alive long enough for you to have kids and for your kids to have kids. But the brain itself doesn't understand alive and dead. It really only understands pain. And it associates pain with death. The more pain I feel, the closer I am to being dead. Right? So, whether it's physical pain, typically is where this has come from. If I'm stabbed with something, physical pain, I'm closer to being dead. And so therefore, the brain's job is to try and help you to avoid pain. I mean, its primary role is avoid pain, not seek pleasure, even though that is another part. But the primary role is to avoid pain, because that's how you survive. And it's really got no concern whether you're happy in surviving. It just wants to make sure you're alive long enough to have kids. That's it, right? And so if your brain or your mind or your thoughts are in so much pain, then in reality, if you're thinking purely from a brain point of view, suicide would stop the pain. It would end. Your brain is doing what it is designed to do, coming up with options to stop the pain. I think what a lot of people do in that circumstance is then start saying to themselves, don't think about suicide. I don't want to, I don't want to do it, of course, right? I don't want to do it, but don't think about, that's a terrible thought. But But that then becomes their sole focus, trying not to think about suicide. And they close themselves down to a whole bunch of other options that are fantastic to remove themselves of the pain.
Yeah.
And you will hear people that have survived suicide attempts talk about feeling like they had no other option. And
Yes.
I feel like a lot of the times what that really is that we so focus down on the suicidal thought that we don't ever allow ourselves to fully consider the other options. And something that I found very beneficial was, if that thought would come up, was to have a conversation with myself to say, okay, Brian, what you're doing is natural, but it's not helpful. That's not a helpful option, right? It's an option. Fantastic. You're doing your job. Appreciate you. But that's not the best option. So why don't we come up with some more? So acknowledge that the thought actually exists instead of trying to, close down the thought. Because again, if you've ever tried to not think about something, by definition, you're actually thinking about it, right? And so it's probably, in my case, a lot better scenario to say, you know what, Brain, good job. You came up with an option. I like where you started, right? You started with an option, just not a good one. How about we come up with another one, and then another one, and then another one. And now all of a sudden we've created at least a thought pattern that says, well, maybe if I talk to somebody, or maybe if I go for a run, or maybe if I listen to some music, or maybe if I hug my kids or something, right? Like you're just allowing yourself that alternative view. And, I found that very beneficial in my own journey, certainly some of the people that I've worked with. But, sometimes that understanding that a lot of the things our brain does is very natural. It's just not helpful all the time. And accepting that and having a conversation around that, I think can allow people some grace if they have thoughts they don't really want to have.
Yeah. And I think to my sort of initial question, what I heard you saying is basically you want to look for other options. If you have that thought, you look for other options. If you can't find some, I would probably say trigger yourself to reach out to someone and say exactly that. Because it sounds like you just need to give your brain more options, and then you can also think about solutions then there. And so I guess reaching out to anyone would be helpful. Would you say it would be more the people that love you that would help the most, or not necessarily? Is it more like, I trust this person will be able to help me? Is that how I select someone who reach out to be not alone in this?
I actually think it depends on the person themselves. At the end of the day, anybody is better than nobody, right? So it doesn't really matter. But some people feel more comfortable talking to people they trust. Other people will feel like if I talk to someone who loves me, they will judge me, and they may leave me if they feel like I think that I'm weak, or I'm crazy, or I've got problems. And so you could have either, and in which case talking to a stranger is actually a lot easier, because you don't actually care if the stranger isn't your friend anymore, because they were never your friend in the first place. And so really it is a very individual thing. Certainly, again, talking to somebody is better than nobody. And I've not really found a case where if someone's spoken to a loved one, that the loved one has ever judged them poorly and left them. I've never experienced that, but that doesn't mean that people don't feel like that might happen, right? And so if people are worried about that scenario, then a total stranger, an anonymous helpline, or in Australia we have Beyond Blue or Lifeline, which is Lifeline is around a lot of places in the world, and that can be the first point as well. So it really just comes down to who you feel most comfortable telling first, and typically that goes okay, and you probably will tell another person. There's a lot of support lines too that have people with lived experience. So either if we're talking about suicide, they've either attempted suicide, or they're related to somebody who has, or they have a lived experience of it. And some people may feel more comfortable talking to somebody who understands intimately what their thoughts are, and so I think it really depends on the individual. but anybody is best.
So what happened for you after you acknowledged that there was an issue? Like, what were the next steps that you took?
I went to the doctor, just the GP. It wasn't
Okay.
my GP. I'd moved recently, so I didn't even have a GP that really knew me where I was. And to be honest, I got, because of the research that I was doing into it, I got scared that, pretty soon the next steps might be to do something silly. So I just made a commitment to go to the doctor. And I promised myself at that point, I think I was probably scared enough that whatever they told me to do, I would do. I no longer, I wanted to take all the thought process off me. I didn't want to consider whether that was the right thing, wrong thing. It was just, Doc, this is what I'm thinking. What should I do? I had seen a psychologist on and off for a bit. I went to some group therapy for gambling as well. And look, some of those things, for a long period of time, I was still gambling, even though I was going to the group meetings. And I was still struggling a little bit, but not as much as I was. I think it's also realistic to let people know that just because I went to the doctor didn't mean it all got fixed the next day, but
Yeah.
it got fixed enough that I got through the next day, and then it got fixed a little bit more that I got through the next day and the next, and eventually, what happens when you start to stack some of these wins together is that you wake up one day and you look back and think, oh, hang on, I'm no longer thinking those things anymore. I'm no longer doing those things anymore. And the most difficult part about it is really the consistency and continuing to turn up to do the things. But, again, once you get the problem out of your own head, it gets a little better. It gets better enough that you can get through another day or another experience or another week. And then you build from there. Like any good success story, it's built on a foundation and it's built with consistency, not with one big effort and then a quick drop off.
The gambling, was it escapism just to forget about the daily grind, or was that more like a different excitement? There's a reason why I asked this question,
that's okay.
by the way, not just
Yeah, look,
nosy.
My personal belief, and this might be a little bit controversial to some people, is that all addiction is an addiction to escapism. It's an addiction to an escape. And I do appreciate and accept, I've done a lot of studies on it, I accept that there are physical dependencies on some drugs and alcohol at a particular point in time. But the reason that we typically are drawn towards a substance or a thing or a behavior is that it in some way provides us a reward. And what I've found over time is that reward is typically an escape from a thought that we don't want to have. Perhaps it's time alone in our own head that we don't want to spend. Then the longer we do that behavior, the behavior itself becomes the problem as well. Right? So we might drink one day to forget about some problems, but if we drink every day to forget about the problems, the drinking becomes the problem, right? And I think often then what we do is we focus on trying to stop drinking and we try and focus on stopping gambling, which is something we need to do, right? That is a part of the process. But to me, it doesn't stop there, because if you don't address the source or the cause, and you only attack the symptom, I think in most cases the addiction is the symptom, not the cause, and so therefore the work needs to be a little deeper. But so for me, gambling, you do get highs and lows. Right? That's all true, but gambling was an escape. I had noise in my head, and gambling was a way that shut it off 100% of the time. Music would work sometimes, exercise would work sometimes, but gambling would work every time. And eventually, over 10 years, it gets out of control. You find yourself escaping before you've even considered what you're doing. So that's it. Basically, in the book that I wrote about it, I call it the ego, the excuse, and the escape. And the escape was gambling. I had an excuse of depression, but ultimately my ego, not my chest beating ego, but me internally, was the problem. I had to fix me, not my depression. I didn't have to fix depression. I didn't have to fix gambling. I had to fix me, and get right, get right inside. And those other things went away once I did that.
Yeah. So taking you as an example then, like, it went to the point that things really fell apart. But if you would have recognized that earlier, or as you said, like you only showed up with a particular part of you, if you would have brought yourself fully to all parts of your life, like what would have been the path? Like how would that have changed? I'm trying to figure out, so that there was an issue of you compartmentalizing yourself, and that didn't feel natural and good, and so you escaped that through gambling. Would there have been a way to turn this around earlier?
Yes, the path. Again, in my experience, in the I suppose hundreds of people that I've worked with one-on-one, in the research that I've done, the path is to be more conscious as early as you can in life, to create a clear and conscious identity, a compelling vision of a future. And what I've now come to realize is that in the absence of a conscious identity, we all become a victim of circumstance, a victim of conditioning, and a victim of comfort. And if you are not conscious about who you are, the things that you've always done just because you've always done them become your guiding principles. And if you're not conscious about who you are, and somebody says to you on Friday, do you want to come for a beer? And you're not really conscious, you're like, oh, yeah, okay, that's what I'll do. That's a circumstance that gets in the way. And if you're not conscious about who you are, and your alarm goes off in the morning, but it's more comfortable to stay in bed than it is to get up, then you tend to just be a victim of that comfort. But if you can become conscious of who you are, then you start to really align yourself with your purpose. And look, I'm not saying you don't still stay in bed or you don't go for beers with your friends, but you at least do it from a conscious decision point of view, not purely because that's what the external world is putting upon you, or that you're seeking some form of external validation. Or, if you don't consciously know who you are, you look externally for all of your cues. So when someone gives you praise, you're like, oh, maybe that's what I should be. Or someone tells you that you were good at, oh, maybe that's what I should be. Or you see something on Instagram and you say, oh, maybe that's what I should want, because I don't know who I am, right? But once you learn who you are, you can very clearly and easily direct your purpose towards the things that you want. If going out with the boys on Friday night for a beer is part of what you want to do, fantastic. But I've got to tell you, what I want to do on Saturday morning is more important to me than going out for beers on Friday night. I get to make that choice now.
Yep.
In the past, an unconscious conditioning made that choice for me. And now I consciously say, well, you know what, I'd like to go out for beers, but I'd also like to do this at 6 a.m. on Saturday morning. What's my choice? This is a conscious choice now. What am I choosing between? And in doing so, I think we free up a hell of a lot of time. I seem to be able to do far more these days than ever before. And I have so much more free time because I'm not second guessing anything that I do. I know exactly who I am. I know the purpose for which I'm doing something, and everything has its place. I can be 100% present here. And when we get off this, I move to the next thing and I can be 100% present there, because I'm not trying to be something different here and then thinking, hang on, did I say the right thing there? Because I needed to do that over there. And what about this thing I've got tomorrow? Life just becomes a lot simpler, a lot more fulfilling. And I genuinely believe that then becomes a higher performance tool, and sustainable high performance tool. You can live this life that I'm living now forever. I don't know that you can live the jumping in and out and around of things successfully and fulfillingly for a long period of time.
So knowing your identity, that's really where the issues start. If you don't, if you're not clear on your identity, therefore not on your priorities, you say yes to things that if you would ask you honestly, you should actually say no, which means you can say yes to the things that you really want to do. But if you're not clear on your identity in a sense, it leads to being unsatisfied and wanting to escape a reality that is basically not matching with what you actually enjoy.
Yeah, and look, sometimes you might still choose to do the same things, but I mean,
Yes.
as Simon Sinek will talk about, finding your why. If you did the same thing, but on one occasion you kind of felt like you were just on the treadmill and that's what everyone else was doing, and therefore I did it. Or alternatively, you did the same thing, but with a conscious thought process in line with who you are as a person. The outcome of those two things are probably very different internally, the way they feel.
Yes.
Right? So it's the same thing. I mean, and that's why I talk about my previous job. I may well have, I would still have picked that job, I believe, because it's, I love it and I love the things that I did. What I wouldn't have had was a 10-year race to rock bottom. I may have altered some of the things that I did inside that career to be even more successful. But, I think anybody at any stage can start to seek the answers to those questions as to who am I? And what I think is, you might get a little bit lucky and all the stuff that you do isn't too far away from who you would choose to be. But the further you get away from your true values or your true purpose, the chasm becomes great and you feel it inside, right? You feel off, right? You start doing things that don't please you. You start regretting behaviors. You might, if it's drinking, you wake up the next day wishing you didn't go out drinking. Or if you cheat on a partner, you wake up later on and you go, I wish I didn't do that. You start to feel guilty about things. These are all indicators that you are starting to be a little bit away from who you are as a person. And one of the difficulties for high performers, people really at the pointy end, is that the fall is a lot greater. So if you're away from your values and you're right at the top of your game, right at the top of peak performance, and your values can be a very long way away from you. If there are people out there in the world that are just happy to plod along, it's very hard to get so far away from your values when you're just taking the step after the step. But if you're shooting for the stars and you get that wrong, you could be a long way from where you intended to end up. Even if that star is still the same place that you would have wanted to end up, if you don't really do it for a conscious reason, you get there and look around and you're like, well, is this it? This is not what I expected. I thought all my problems would be solved once I got here. Once I made $1 million, I thought, I'd be happy. All of those things start to come up if you don't do it with a conscious intent.
How can we make sure that we don't even get there? Like how do we become that conscious and having a strong me identity? And maybe for parents, how can you support your children to go on that path and actually give them that gift of knowing what they want or who they are and what they believe in? And
yeah, look, I think the first question, or the first thing to do is ask yourself, or perhaps even ask your children, who are you? Right? And I will say that, especially if I'm talking at companies these days, I will ask people to maybe for a minute just write down a couple of sentences about who they are. And then I ask them to let me know if either of their first two sentences doesn't have something to do with what they do for work or their family. So most people, if I asked, even if I asked you who you are, you say, well, I'm Sebastian, I run, I run the podcast, and you're into, is it the saunas that you've got? Right.
We do infrared saunas, wellness company. That's right. Father,
right.
That type of thing.
And we start to say that that's who I am, but none of those are who you are. Right.
Yeah.
You run a wellness company. You are a father, but that's not who you are. That's a thing that you do, right? And
okay,
who you are might be purpose driven, might be disciplined, might be value connection, might be present. Now, those characteristics make you a good father. They probably make you a good business owner, but who you are is that question. So, so that part of asking yourself genuinely, when I ask people again, I'll say, what are your values? And most people will tell me I know what my values are. And then I ask them, I say, okay, well, tell me what they are. And they respond with, no, I know what they are. And I say, yeah, that's good. Just tell me what they are. And most people can't, right? They'll start to say things like, well, families are my value, and they rattle off things that auto cue sort of responses. And, the reason most people don't really want to get down and dirty with figuring out their values is they're probably going to have to admit that for a period of time they weren't living their values, right? So, and that's okay, because none of us live our values 100% of the time. But what we don't want to do is admit that we haven't been doing it. So the easiest way to do that is not even admit what they are, right? But if we were talking to our kids, or even talking to ourselves, we might ask them, what are the things that are important to you? I'll ask clients all the time, if you were 95 and those nearest and dearest to you are around you, what would you like them to say about you? Not talk about your job, but what would you like them to say about your character? Your best friend. What do you like about your best friend? People that you've admired and looked up to in life. What are the qualities that they have that made you look up to them? And typically what we will do is we will see in other people the things that we value. Right? What we want our friends and family to say about us when we're 95 is quite typically something that I value. I want them to see me for who I am. Right? That's my character. And that's a very easy first pass at asking that question, who am I? Right? And you are made up then of those values, and then perhaps you might want to explore beliefs and those sorts of things. But primarily, our identity is intrinsically linked to a set of values, and those values we can find in some, I suppose, novel ways if we're prepared to ask the question.
Very powerful. Do you find that younger generations have more of that in them, that they are a bit more, value driven, or is it just an age thing and it just goes away? What do you think?
Look, I think the answer is strangely yes and no. I think the younger generation has it in them to be curious, to seek the answers, to actually ask the question, or to at least talk up about the question. I think the older generation, when they start the process, has the discipline and the ability to be uncomfortable long enough to make sure they get to the bottom of the answer. I do fear that sometimes the younger generation, while willing to be open about the exploratory path, do tend to still take the first and easiest option that presents itself. And I find that most people's first response is a lie. Most typically because we don't want to upset ourselves, again, that we hadn't been living our values or anything like that. But it's very easy to say, well, family is my number one value, and honesty is a value of mine, and just rattle these words off and then go, that's it, I'm done, rather than really exploring, not to say that family and honesty aren't important to people, but really exploring what are your true values. What are the things that, and what are the stories around your values that you can tell that give them meaning to you, that help you determine whether you're living them out, that give you that story that says, how does this version of Sebastian want to show up today? What would this Sebastian do? A great, what would Jesus do? Well, we might not be that interested in what Jesus would do, but what would this version of Sebastian do? Well, that's important, right? My values are on my phone, just because I look at my phone a lot. I don't know how much attention I pay to them, but I can rattle my values off. And if I feel a bit if I've been out and I feel a bit hot and bothered, and I drive into the driveway, I'll pull it out and I'll say, well, how does this Gary walk inside to his family? And I'll just give myself that conscious reframe of, this Gary has to walk inside. What is important about, this Gary and coming into his family? And that is again, it's just a good conscious reframe rather than hot and just bothered and get out of my way. And, it's like, no, hang on. That's finished. This is who I am. What would this Gary do in all circumstances? And then I get a chance to answer that question.
Can you give a couple of examples of what they are?
My values?
Just to give it a bit of context.
My values are purpose, growth, gratitude, discipline, presence, and service. They have different meanings to me than they may well to somebody else. But for instance, I create stories around them. So for me, my number one value being purpose, for a long time, the main story I would say around that is that my shit has to be worth something, or my pain has to be worth something. Everything that I'd been through in my life, the stuff that I've done wrong, the battles with depression and addiction, the people that I'd hurt, to me that had to mean something. And not just to work in that same field, right? But to be a better husband, a better family man, a better friend, a better employee, or a better business owner. So all of those lessons, I could always look back and say, all right, I need to be better. That pain, that lesson, I have to learn it and make sure that it exists in my life differently today. I've got a 6-month-old baby now, baby girl, and I've added to purpose now. And the next version of the story is, whilst one was focused on making sure my pain meant something, is that my role is to be her standard. That's the story I tell. That's the line I give. And
awesome.
And my narrative around that is, at some stage in her life, she's going to meet a man and allow a man, into her life, either as a friend, as a partner, as a boss, as an employer. My job is to make sure that I set a standard for her, that she understands what level of man she should let in her life. So now I can go, if I'm training in the gym and I feel like I want to stop early, well, I'll ask myself, is this the type of guy that I think my daughter should be involved with? No. Well, my job is to be her standard. If I can be as best that standard, then she gets the opportunity to at least see what the minimum standard is. And that drives me. That is my purpose, right? And now, again, when I was talking before about taking my identity and just and inserting it into different roles rather than changing my identity per role, when I have this conversation with you, I ask that question. What would be the minimum standard that I would expect if I was my daughter's partner or boss? What would I expect of that guy? What should she expect of that man to show up? How would he show up? When I go to the gym, how would he show up? When I go to work, when I work with a client, this is the standard, the minimum standard that I want my daughter to know exists. And if I don't do that, then very powerful, I've let her down, right? So that's how I create the story around my values. And again, I do that with each one of them. They all have their own story. But it's an iterative process. I mean, the first go at my values list didn't look like that, and every few months I review it and maybe update the story, maybe update the list. It's an ongoing process. I do think that primarily your core values will probably remain for your whole life, but the story around them might shift a little bit. And I want to make sure that I don't let them down again, let those values down again. So I keep looking at them, I reflect on them, I reimagine them if I need to. And, I ask myself the question a lot, what would this Gary do?
You've worked with hundreds of mostly men.
Mostly men, yeah. Look,
mostly men,
probably about 70% men.
Yeah. I could imagine that when you send them off on the journey of really figuring this out, that might clash with the job they're in, the relationship they're in. How does that go? Like, does that just, do people have to quit their job? Do they just have a conversation with their manager? Like, what a good solution? I just could imagine, because money has come somewhere. You have to live somewhere, and you want someone close. But if you actually realize, I'm not that person that wants to be with this person because our values really clash, and I have to compromise my values to be with that person, and the same in the job. Where does it lead?
Well, it really depends on the individual. What they at least get is the opportunity to make a conscious decision towards what they want to do. And sometimes those decisions have some short-term pain attached to them. But I think ultimately, if you continue to make decisions that are not in line with who you are, the long-term pain is probably going to be greater. But by the same token, just because somebody goes through a values exercise and may decide that the career that they've been in for 10 years is not right for them, in my view, doesn't mean they quit tomorrow. That starts the next process of, because you also need to figure out what is important to you. And look, there's some people that just the story has been told wrong to themselves. And in the case that I would be thinking of is that, there's some people that don't love their job necessarily, and maybe their job isn't fulfilling to them. It's not their purpose. It's not what they've been designed to do. However, their job might afford them enough money so that they can live their purpose in other ways. Now, if your purpose is to be the world's greatest dad who always goes to your son's soccer training 3 nights a week and to the games on the weekend, well, it doesn't matter if you're the school janitor, because you start work at 9 and you finish at 3, and you can always make the training, right? If your main purpose is that son's training, then finishing work at 3 is probably more important than a high-flying job that finishes at 6 p.m. or 7 p.m., even though it might pay more money. And so sometimes it just comes down to reframing, when you start to understand what your values are, your purpose and your identity, how do things fit? Right? It's not that you have to work in the job that is your values or your purpose, but how does it fit in with your values and your purpose and your, and the things that you want out of your life? And so, look, sometimes people do have a realization that the partner I've been with for a long time is not the partner that I would choose to be with. And then we have different conversations about, can they become that person? Can you become that person? Does either party have the interest in becoming that person?
Yes.
But I do, brutal honesty is one of my values, I suppose, in my business. And ultimately, if you're with somebody that you don't want to be with, in reality, the decision's already made. Now, we can work on ways to get you to that point better, but I'm not really sure that if you've already decided you don't want to be with them, and to be quite frank, by the time they've come to me, they already know the answer. They just don't want to say it out loud. Right? They're not happy in their relationships. Yes. They're not happy in work. They're making mistakes. They're drinking too much. They're gambling. They're investing in Bitcoin when they don't know a darn thing about Bitcoin. They're looking at other women or other men, or they're cheating on their partner, or they're sitting on the couch all day doing nothing, or they're eating too much food. They already know that something's going wrong. They just aren't yet capable to say, this is it. They just don't want to admit that this is what it is. And that's the first part of the process. And the great thing is from there is that now you get an opportunity to actually, I don't care if you're 20, 30, 50, 80, when you get to this realization, you now get a chance to live the rest of your days moving towards that, that version of yourself that is compelling, that you do want to be. And, that's a really great place to be, even though it does come with, taking a little bit of skin off sometimes along the way.
Yeah, I understand. So when other people see that someone is suffering and struggling with something, or just overall is somehow off tilt and unbalanced, what's the best way to get to these people? Or is it highly individual? Like sometimes the best friend can do wonders and the partner can do wonders, and sometimes the partner can't do anything and needs to come from somewhere else. Like, what chances do we have to reach these people, really?
Yeah, look, I think it's very difficult to reach somebody that's hurting, because they ultimately need to reach that point themselves. But I do think that it can be facilitated. I think it would be rare for you to just say to somebody, hey, you've got this problem, and they go, yeah, you're right, actually. Thank you for that.
I changed my life right up.
So look, ultimately, if your friends have started recognizing you've got a problem, or to be honest, if you started recognizing your friends have got a problem, some part of them knows it already. And one of the reasons why they revolt against you telling them they've got a problem is because they know it. They just don't know what to do about it. And they don't want to be that person. Because if their life is in such a state where their behaviors are now obvious to you, you're probably talking about at least 6 months, if not longer, that they've kind of felt it themselves. They don't know what it is. They just, I used to say, I knew I had a problem. I just didn't know what it was, and I knew even less what to do about it. And so for a long time, people will know that. I think it is important to have honest conversations with people, especially if you're very close, like if you have a trusted relationship, without judgment, and perhaps saying something like, "Hey, Sebastian, I just realized that you've been a bit off lately. Is there something that you want to talk about?" They will most likely say, "No, I'm fine," or "I've just got to get through something."
Okay.
But they might not. They might tell you straight up. But if they say they're fine, you say, "Okay, that's okay." But if you ever do want someone to chat to, just let me know, right? Like, you also don't want to make your friends feel like they're going to be ostracized, or that they're weird or anything like that.
Yeah.
Another very powerful thing that I've found, if you've got a friend that's struggling and you in some way have struggled yourself, sharing your own struggle will often provide, I think I might have heard Tony Robbins say this, that being vulnerable gives other people permission to be vulnerable. And so if you have it in you to, and I've found this a lot, that people that didn't know my story before, when I've opened up about it, have just blurted out everything. Right? Just because I think it's inside us. We think, well, if this person's had problems, they're not going to judge me for my problems. This is a safe place.
Yes.
That can be helpful if you have had an issue in your life or a struggle and you are happy to share it. I think that can be helpful. And look, another thing that I think can be helpful is to demonstrate. Often if we've got partners, we like to tell them that they need to change, but we don't feel the need to change ourselves. And, if perhaps you need to stop hitting snooze on your alarm, and you need to start changing the way that you eat your nutrition, and that you need to cut down on your drinking, and, perhaps not encourage that, "Oh, we'll go out tonight and I'm going to drink, but you can't drink because you're always silly when you drink." It's like, well, you know what? How about we both don't drink? And perhaps you go and see a counselor or a therapist or a coach or a psychologist, or you invest in some personal development or some growth. And maybe your partner will jump on board, and maybe they won't. But you're probably going to be better off for it anyway. So, it's not going to hurt. And then I do think that people need to make good decisions for themselves as well. I think they have to be very mindful that sometimes, especially if it's a relationship, an intimate relationship, that your partner's behavior, if it is negative for a long period of time, is going to have a negative effect on you. And people have to be mindful of their own safety and their own mental health and their own security. And they have to make good decisions for themselves first, not for their partners first. You can be a good supporter, but you don't have to knock around your own mental health and your own self-worth in order to do that. So I think it's very important that if you are caring for somebody that is struggling, that you make sure that you are making sensible and conscious decisions around your own safety or mental health as well.
Powerful, so powerful. Absolutely fundamental. If you get it right, and one can see that easily with you, you're a happy, purposeful person that enjoys life, and enjoys working with people.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I think it doesn't mean you don't have bad days, and it doesn't mean that you don't experience negative things, but everything comes with perspective when you are, again, very conscious about who you are and where you're going. You get to use negatives in a far different way than if you're a victim of everything in life. And, I think for me, it's a very, very nice place to live. And I'm certainly glad, and I've found a way now to be very grateful for, excuse my language, for the shit in my life, because without it, I wouldn't have found this. And having found this, I really can't be angry at anything that's happened before.
Yeah, awesome. And you are making your learnings and insights available as well. I believe you mentioned already one-on-one work is possible.
Yeah. I usually offer everybody a free coffee. If it's by Zoom, you might have to make your own coffee. But I like to, before I work with people, I also want to make sure that there's a good relationship, that I can actually help people. So I work one-on-one with people. It used to be men primarily. It's typically now more in a high performance field, or probably a a more alpha personality, action-taking type of field. So military, police, business, executives, athletes, that sort of realm. But anybody needs help, if I'm available, I'm available. I do business consulting as well for mental strength, and I work with a few clients on high performance as well. I do high performance coaching for athletes and executives and those types of things. So yeah, you can find me for that. I write a little bit. I'm doing a PhD next year, so I'll be doing my own thesis. So hopefully I don't have those same thoughts.
I'm sure you won't.
that you did. And
I was a bit younger.
I speak around town as well at a few conferences. Every now and then on Instagram and YouTube, and through great things like having discussions with yourself. And if anyone wants to find me, they can Google my name, which is on the screen, and should come up with some nice stuff. There's a few bad things in there from my past as well, but we've spoken about those already. And
makes it colourful.
That's right. We've all got a story, and or you can find me at Strong Mend, MEND, where most of my business stuff.
MEND.com. Yeah, very cool. Yeah, and I would also encourage any business owner or someone who leads a department to engage with you maybe for speaking events, because it is easy to understand. Overall, your message is easy to understand because it is something that matters to everyone, and everyone has thought about it in one way or another. And if I think about leading a team and I have someone who can really trigger the team to ask these deep questions, from a really selfish perspective, you probably have a happier team, but also you have maybe a better performing team, and maybe the people that actually don't fit because they said, actually, this is not my passion, might also then make the right decision and make space for people who fit right. So I think your message is super, super powerful and so needed, because I think it makes the whole world a better place when people actually live purpose and not just showing up was part of them.
Just on that too, I genuinely believe, I think there's no doubt that building mental strength and resilience is a performance tool. It is a high performance tool, and in particular, I think in workplaces these days you get the double benefit of having your staff feel valued, and find their own purpose, their own level of resilience, and that helps them outside of work, which naturally helps them inside of work. And I've certainly found that it has a very large ROI in the long run to value your staff, to value culture, and to help them build their own mental strength and resilience. And it's a funny, but it doesn't matter whether you're an individual, a team, or a company. We all go through the same thought processes. Our brains are all wired the same way, and if you can learn to understand them, you can learn to control them, and our own brains, not control other people's brains, but you can. Once we understand them, we can fix them, and we can build on them, and we can create anything that we want once we know that path.
Terrific, Gary. Thank you so much for your time. That was invaluable. Really appreciate you being here.
I appreciate it, Sebastian, and I love the stuff that you're doing in your wellness stuff, but also with the podcast. There's some really good stuff there, mate, and I look forward to talking again sometime in the future.
That would be great. Strong, MEND, strongmend.com, everyone. Thank you so much, Gary.
We hope you got a lot out of today's inspiring conversation. Please share this episode with someone you know needs to hear it. Whether they are a seasoned health expert or just beginning their wellness journey, these stories of remarkable transformation, success, and valuable insights will certainly help empower more people. Until next time, have the best life ever.